In this video, I am going to cover N64 emulation using the PC version of Retroarch. It's no secret that I'm a fan of the N64. I love the history of this system as well as a majority of its games. That being said, N64 emulation has remained in the dark ages for quite some time, and it hasn't been until the last year and a half that it's really advanced to the point of amazingness. By using Retroarch in combination with Mupen 64 plus Next and the Parallel RDP and RSP, you get this amazing N64 emulation quality that just beats anything that's been done to date. It makes practically every single game playable, and it just looks absolutely stunning. It does come at a great performance toll though, so you do need a machine capable of running it if you want it to look this good. Thankfully, most decent speed CPUs from the Intel 6000 series up, and anything from the Ryzen 3000 series up should do just fine. But let's go ahead and dive in. So to get started with the PC version of Retroarch and doing N64 emulation in it, you need to install the PC version of Retroarch. This guide is a continuation of my how to install Retroarch PC video, so refer back to that to get Retroarch up and running on your computer, link in the description or upper right hand corner of the screen. Once you have Retroarch installed how you want it, the next thing we're going to need are N64 games. Now there are a number of ways to get these. You can use a Retro 2 hardware dumper, or if you have an older Windows 98 computer and a Game Shark, I have a video on my channel on how to use those to back up your N64 collection. It can be quite time consuming, but it's honestly pretty fun. I freaking loved this video. Alternatively, you could also dump the N64 games that were present on the Wii and Wii U virtual consoles if you have a hacked Wii or Wii U. Then of course there's also the shady parts of the net where you can download these things, but yeah. I don't give a crap which way you do it, but don't ask for any download links as none will be provided because that's illegal and I don't share illegal content on my channel, and for those of you that think that you can convince me to do so, suck it. But anyway, once you have your games sourced, we just need to put them anywhere on our computer. It doesn't matter where they go. In an earlier tutorial video, I just made a Retroarch Games folder inside my PC tutorial folder here, so I'm just going to add my N64 games to that folder. There we go. Again, you can put them anywhere you want on your computer. It doesn't matter. But once you have your N64 games ready to go, let's go ahead and boot into Retroarch. Once Retroarch is booted, we need to get our Mupen 64 plus Next core downloaded, and to do so, you go to Online Updater, Core Updater, and then press the right arrow key on your keyboard to scroll down to Nintendo, and look for Nintendo 64, Mupen 64 plus Next, and then press Enter. And once the core is downloaded, we're ready to begin loading up N64 games, and one of the methods to do so is to go into Load Content, navigate to the folder that you have your N64 games in. So for my example, I have it on the desktop, so it's C, Users, Users Profile, Desktop, and then I put it in Retroarch PC Tutorials, Retroarch Games, N64 Games, and there are my N64 games that I can then select and load up. I don't really care for this method, it's long, slow, so what I like to do instead is make a games playlist, and the easiest way on PC, in my opinion, is to use the Retroarch desktop menu, because it lets you make a playlist and get thumbnails set up. It's really nice. Once the Retroarch desktop menu pops up, you might be greeted with this "Welcome to the desktop menu," so just tell it, "Hey, thanks, get out of my face." So over on the left, there is a playlist/file browser, content browser thing here. So just right click somewhere over here where there's space, and we are going to make a new playlist. Type in Nintendo, space, Nintendo 64. And press Enter. And that gives us a nice little Nintendo 64 playlist entry here on the left. So select this, and now right click over in the main box here, and tell it to add a folder, and then just navigate to where you have your N64 games stored. So again, I had mine on the desktop, Retroarch Games, N64 games, I'm going to tell it to select the folder. Now for the core, we're going to choose Mupen 64 plus Next, Database, Nintendo 64. And once these options are set, press OK, and it should find all of your N64 games that you had in that folder. Now, an optional step you could do if you want to make this playlist look prettier within Retroarch is to download the thumbnails. To do this, just right-click on the N64 entry on the left, download all thumbnails, this playlist. And it will go through your games and try to find the thumbnails and box arts and screenshots for it. but they have to be named a specific way, typically the game name followed by a region code. So as you can see, it's finding some, but it's also failing to find a lot of them for me as well. So there we go. Now when I click on a game, it should bring up the box arts for it if it was able to find them. But let's find one that it couldn't find. So here we go, Castlevania. I don't think it found it because I have it labeled as Rev B. So if I right click and edit the playlist entry and delete the Rev B, and press OK, and then I could tell it to download the thumbnail, it should find it. Yep, there we go. Alternatively, you can manually download box arts from the internet, from places like GameFAQs, and then just drag them into this box art window over here, and it should automatically add them for you. Yeah, Doom 64 is another one, so we can just go ahead and edit that, get rid of the revision, hit OK, and download the thumbnail. Bam. But once you have this playlist set up and made the way you like it, just go ahead and close out of the Retroarch desktop menu, and then re-click on Retroarch and press F on your keyboard to go back into full screen mode. Now, if you're not on the main menu, just press backspace on your keyboard until you get there, because we need to reset Retroarch to get the N64 playlist to show up. So just main menu, restart Retroarch. And there we go. Once it reboots, there is now a nice Nintendo 64 playlist here on the left. So just select that, and then you could just select a game to run and tell it to run. And by default, you can play N64 games using a keyboard, but it's kind of ridiculous to do that with an N64 game. So definitely recommend plugging in a controller. And by default, Retroarch should be able to detect most controllers that are usable on PC and automatically map them. So for example, I just plugged in an Xbox One controller, it picked it up just fine, and I'm able to start playing. And there we go, playing N64 games on a PC through Mupen 64 Plus Next. Now by default, the default settings on Mupen 64 Plus Next will make a number of games perfectly playable, and if you're on a slower computer, the default settings are probably where you're going to want to stick with. So GoldenEye here is pretty great even with default settings, like it runs pretty good. Even games like Pokemon Snap are completely playable now, whereas they used to not be. The red dot still doesn't show up under default settings, so it's not quite 100% accurate, but hey, at least it's playable, whereas it wasn't before. And even Resident Evil 2's infinite standing on top of the backgrounds problems that were present on N64 emulation for a very long time, it just works under default settings, which is great. There's some visual glitches, as you can see, but hey, that's better than it used to be under default. And even challenging to emulate games like Star Wars Rogue Squadron are just perfectly playable under default settings now. Like, this is just fantastic to see how far we've come with N64 emulation. Like, no joke, playing it this way is better than playing the PC version. So for those of you looking to get N64 emulation up and running on your computer, that's really all there is to it these days. You just need to get your games, download the core, and then just start playing. Not anywhere near as much setup required as there used to be, which is just fantastic. Now that being said, I am a huge stickler for accurate N64 emulation, so I want to show you how to get that set up now. So by pressing F1 on your keyboard, you will be brought to the Retroarch quick menu. From here, you can use your controller or arrow keys on your keyboard to scroll down to Options. And the first option we're going to change is to change our RDP plugin from Glide N64 to Parallel RDP. And then the next one we're going to change is the RSP plugin from HLE to Parallel. Now this will require a little bit more CPU power than the stock N64 emulation that comes with Mupen 64 Plus Next, but if you have a decent computer, again, anything Intel 6000 or Ryzen 3000 or higher should be just fine to do this. Now with those options set, I'm just going to go ahead and restart the emulation so they take effect. So close content, and then I'm just going to go ahead and run it again. Now when I load up Rogue Squadron, the video is a little bit more accurate to what you'll see on an actual N64. Most people probably wouldn't like this, but I mean, this is just really cool to me. I'm such a fan of the N64, like I said, so having it look more accurate on a PC is just great to me. But there's even more settings we can change, so I'm going to go back into the Retroarch quick menu, going down to options. So the first option, synchronous RDP, leave this on. VI divot filter, leave that one on. Gamma dither, leave that one on. Anti-aliasing, you can leave this one on or off. If you want to have a sharper picture, you can turn it off. Then you can also disable the N64's bilinear filtering if you want to have a sharper picture there as well. So basically, this is like a VI de-blur mod. Give you the sharper pixels while retaining the look of an N64. It's pretty cool. Again, that's what it looks like with the bilinear filtering enabled. Then there's the VI dither filter. Leave this one on, it gives you better colors. And then here's the one that most of you are probably looking for, and it is to upscale your N64 image. And this is where N64 emulation has always had a problem, is when it comes to upscaling, things start to get kind of broken and whack when you upscale them. But with the Parallel RDP and RSP, it actually upscales them quite correctly, and it's fantastic. So for example, I'm going to crank this up to 4x here, and this one does require a content restart. So just close out of the content and then load it back up again. And now we have 4 times resolution scaled N64 emulation that produces accurate graphics. So as you can see here, it is just looking absolutely fantastic. It does lose out on some of the accuracy of the more blurry N64 image, but I'm sure that a lot of you wouldn't care about that trade-off. Next, we have the ability to super sample the frame buffer effects. This can introduce visual glitches, so I'd say leave it off for now. And then we have the ability to dither the super sampled effects. This is on by default, and I recommend leaving it on. And this next option is pretty interesting. It lets you downsample your resolution output. So if you upscale it by 4 times, you then can reduce that scale by like half. So you can have better, cleaner native image, but then you can downsample it again to kind of give back that blurry look of N64 while having a higher native quality. So, as you can see there, like, that's pretty sweet. Like, just gives it a more authentic look while looking 10 times better in the process. So mess around with this, see if you like it. Otherwise, you could just leave it off for the full sharp picture. But yeah, I like setting this one to 1/8 myself. Just kind of gives you a nice what if. Our next option is to enable native texture level of details. So N64 emulation using the Parallel RDP and RSP does use the highest level of details on assets, even if they're further in the distance where that kind of stuff would kind of be lower detail. So you can enable this and it will use the correct assets for distant objects. It's not as noticeable in Rogue Squadron, but if you're playing GoldenEye, you'll definitely be able to tell a difference on this one. For accuracy's sake, you want to turn it on. If you want games to look better, leave it off. Next, we have native resolution text direct, leave that on. And the next option is an important one. This is our deinterlacing method. So I'm sure you noticed when I switched to the Parallel RDP and RSP that you could see that the image is starting to shake here with 480i Games. And that's because it's using Bob deinterlacing. With our deinterlacing method, we could change between Bob and Weave. Unfortunately, Weave is only good at a 1x scaling factor, so we are kind of stuck with Bob here. So for those of you that play using like an OSSC or something on actual hardware, this shouldn't look that different to you to see the lines alternate like this. But if you want to use 1 times resolution scaling, you could deinterlace using Weave, and then you can even apply a CRT shader to it, and it just looks pretty fantastic. But if you don't want to deal with any of this Bob deinterlacing or any of this accuracy-based stuff, again, just leave it on Glide N64 as the video plugin, and then you don't have to deal with any of this to begin with. Next is frame duplication, and this can kind of smooth out the picture if you have a lower-end system. I don't really notice anything on my system when I turn it on or off, so I just leave it off. Next is frame rate, and this is basically an N64 overclock, so if you turn this on full speed, your games will run at their max frame rate despite N64 hardware limitations. So if there's a game that has a bunch of hardware-induced lag, this will overcome it. For authenticity's sake, I like to leave this on original myself. And next we have another overclock option for the VI refresh. So by default this is set to 1500, but you can crank it up to 2200. And it will just, again, help increase performance on games that would have hardware-induced lag. Again, for authenticity's sake, I leave it set to auto. Next are a bunch of control options for the N64. So analog dead zone %, this is set to 15 by default. You can increase it if you need to, or decrease it if you want to. Analog sensitivity. You can fine-tune how far your stick needs to go to reach maximum N64 value. So you can really fine-tune this to make your control stick feel a little bit more like an actual N64. Then C button mappings, you can just leave these alone. And then depending on your controller, you can set independent C buttons on or off. And the next option is to disable the expansion pack. So the N64 could run with or without the expansion pack. So if you want to see what a game would look like without the expansion pack running, you could tell it to disable it and then restart the game. But for the most part, I just recommend leaving the expansion pack on, so it's just a fun setting to mess around with. Ignore the Ignore Emulated TLB Exceptions option here, we don't want to mess with that. And then finally we have the player packs. So by default it's set to a memory pack for player 1, but you could change this to a rumble pack, a transfer pack. I like to have it on rumble by default, but there's a lot of N64 games that need a memory pack, so you can set that here. And then Mupen 64 Plus Next is working on some transfer pack features. I haven't been able to get them to work yet, but they're coming, and that's really exciting for those of us that like to play Pokemon Stadium. And then you can set the same things for player 2, 3, and 4. And the last option is count per op. Just leave this one alone, don't mess with it. But that does it as far as the parallel RDP and RSP core options are concerned. Again, these are the options I like to use to give myself an authentic N64 experience on the PC. If you have a lower end system or don't care as much about this stuff, just leave this set to Glide and HLE. Like, you're gonna have a pretty good experience either way. But it's just more accurate, which is what I prefer. Like, I'm just a huge stickler for N64 accuracy. For those of you that do want to stick with Glide, just a couple quick options to note. You can change your internal resolution here and here for 4:3 and widescreen resolutions. And then you could also set a widescreen ratio there. And the native resolution rendering factor, you can increase that here. Threaded renderer, depending on the game, you might want to turn this on. If you have it turned on in the Retroarch video settings, you don't need to turn it on here, I don't think. To get a little bit more accurate picture out of Glide N64, you could turn on 3-point bilinear filtering, and then integer scaling filtering, dithering modes, MSAA, FXAA, level of detail. And then another accuracy thing here, you could change the background mode from one piece to stripped. That way it's a little more accurate. Turn on native res 2D text recs. And then, of course, when you get down to the bottom, you have the same options we just covered. Either choice is going to work out pretty well for you. We're getting to the point where high-level emulation is starting to match that of low-level emulation. And one of the benefits of Glide is you don't have to deal with the whole Bob deinterlacing look. So if you really hate Bob deinterlacing, Glide N64 is probably going to be your best bet. Just note that it's not going to be as accurate. Again, hardly anyone's probably going to care about that as much as I do, but I care, so I stick it out with Bob deinterlacing personally. And honestly, for me, like, you can't beat these results. Like, it just looks absolutely fantastic. And then if you're running a game that's in 240p, like, oh, it just looks so good. And you don't even have to worry about the Bob deinterlacing at that point because it's 240p, so it's a progressive image. So yeah, for me, N64 emulation really doesn't get much better than this. Like, I just love the way it looks. You can fine-tune controls. And if you plug in something like the Retro Fighters USB Brawler or Retrobit USB Tribute 64, like, you can have yourself a freaking authentic N64 experience right on a PC now. But I think that's really going to do it as far as the core options are concerned. Again, there's just so many things that you can mess around with. You got a few video backends you can mess around with, depending on if you want a more accurate image or one that'll run faster for you. Now, one thing you could do is also save per game options. So say you want to have a game that runs on Parallel, or if you want to have a game that runs on Glide, you could save those per game by going up to the Manage Core options and saving them as a game option. Alternatively, you can also set a whole entire core override if these are just the options you want to have load up for every N64 game that you play. But I think that's really going to do it as far as N64 emulation is concerned. Again, we have come such a long way in the last year and a half when it comes to N64 emulation, and it is just so fantastic now. As always, if you happen to have any questions, feel free to ask me down in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to try to help you out. But now if you could all do me a huge favor, and please be sure to hit that like or dislike button, just depending on how much you like today's video. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit that sub button so you can see when new videos like this go live. Really goes a long way to helping out the channel and keeping it growing, and we are just super grateful to all of you for that. We're so close to hitting our goals, and that's because of each and every one of you. Just huge thank you from all of us here in the household. If you'd like to further help support the channel, be sure to check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen as well. A little really goes a long way to keeping us going, so we appreciate all of you who have done so. Champions, you freaking rock stars, you just rock. Thank you so much. But that's going to do it for this one, so until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, stay awesome, and we will see you all back next video.